Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Welcome to today's show, everybody. I am really excited about this one because, and it's probably my favorite podcast we've done, or I've done up to this point, because I got to talk to Dr. Herman Pontzer, who is a professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. And I have been reading his work probably since 2015, 2016. And in 2017, he actually put out an article that really changed the way I looked at metabolism forever. And I think a lot of us changed the way we looked at metabolism forever. And in this particular episode, I got to sit down with him. He was gracious enough to take time out of his laboratory work and sit and talk to me about all the mythology around metabolism, as well as the implications of his work as it relates to metabolism. He's really done over 2 decades of research in this field. And one of the things I love about him is that he is an evolutionary anthropologist, meaning that all this talk about paleo man and what our ancestors ate and whether we should be eating raw or low carb or high fat or low fat or whatever it is, he's actually studied this from every angle. He's lived with hunter-gatherer tribes. He's studied the fossil record. He eats, lives, and breathes this stuff. But not only that, he's also been steeped in the world of metabolism and energy expenditure, which makes him a very, very unique voice in this field. It's rare that we get to have a real expert in the field, someone who whose information I am using and people like me are using to actually pass on the information to you. And so this was really exciting for me. We talk a lot about his new book, which is really where you want to go after listening to this episode. You want to go get his book and listen to it immediately. I'm actually on my 2nd read. The book is called Burn. New research blows the lid off how we really burn calories, lose weight, and stay healthy, by Dr. Herman Pontzer, PhD. I am super excited for you to sit and listen to this conversation. It really was by far my favorite podcast so far. Sit back and enjoy Dr. Pontzer. All right, I'm really excited today because I have a special guest on, Dr. Herman Pontzer, PhD. I have to tell you, Dr. Pontzer, so when I first came across your work, I read, this must have been, 2017? I read an article, and I'm sitting there reading this article that you did, and I'm just like, this can't be right. This absolutely cannot be true. Right. And it blew my mind. And since then, I've been following your work. I pre-ordered your book, Burn, which, by the way, I have right here for everybody. This is Dr. Pontzer's new book. I pre-ordered this as soon as I found out you wrote it, because it's rare in my mind for a PhD who eats, lives, breathes this thing to step into the world of sort of, what you call it, armchair engineer sort of.
Popular science, maybe.
Yeah. And, wading into this world is, I think, tough for a PhD like yourself, because you're in this other world, and now you're like, okay, now I need to translate this for people like Jade and people like the other people who don't do this for a living. So new research, let me just read the subtitle because I think this is exactly what it is. New research blows the lid off how we really burn calories, lose weight, and stay healthy. So I'll start this question with the thing that blew me away. And it was basically this: we don't burn calories the way that we think we do in terms of adding our calorie burn to our total daily energy expenditure. And when I read that in your study, it kind of just blew me away. So can you explain to us what this actually means? Because it shakes up everything I think we've ever thought about exercise.
Yeah, thanks. So, well, I think the easiest way to tell this story is to tell it the way that I came to this, which was as surprised as you were, I think. I'm an anthropologist. I study human evolution. I want to know how the body evolved and how that kind of shapes the way health and our lives work today, how the past shapes the present. And so, I've always been interested in energy expenditure, how the body burns calories. And that's because that's where the rubber hits the road in evolutionary biology, right? All organisms are evolved to get energy in from their environment in the form of food or, sunlight if you're a plant, but, to bring energy in and to turn that into offspring. That's where that is it. That's the fundamental, central bit of evolutionary biology there. And so energy expenditure is really central to all of that. And I realized I'd been studying energy expenditure and walking and running and locomotion in graduate school, and I'd done that for about 5 or 6 years. And I knew that stuff very well. Exercise, energy expenditure, I knew it very well. And I wanted to understand how that works into the sort of the whole picture of the calories burned per day for a human. But I wanted to do that in an ecologically relevant context. I wanted to do that where it mattered, right? And for humans, this weird world that we built ourselves, these zoos that we live in, these are not normal, right? These are all very recent, constructs. We're a hunting and gathering species. Our humans and our ancestors have been hunting and gathering for 2.5 million years. And so I wanted to go to a hunting and gathering population, look and ask the question, how does locomotion, how does walking, working, how does that fit into energy expenditure there? And I had the same expectation that you would have had, which is we know they're really physically active. And so when we measure their calories expended by men and women in this hunting and gathering population, it's going to be through the roof, right? Because they're getting literally, the men get 19,000 steps a day, women get 13,000 steps a day. This is the Hadza community I work with in northern Tanzania. They still hunt and gather. Really amazing, magical place to work. Anyway, we went there, we did the measurements. We used this isotope tracking technique, which gives us this really precise, accurate measurement of how many calories you're burning every day. Got all the samples back home, ran the data, and I'm expecting to see this really elevated expenditure for these guys. That's the whole reason we got the money to go do the work. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those moments as a scientist where you're like, wow, I didn't really expect this. I need to recalibrate pretty much everything I thought I knew, because it's not what we saw at all. They had the same energy expenditures in the Hadza community as we have in the US and Europe, even though the differences in activity level couldn't be more stark. And so that tells us that the body isn't working the way we thought it does, the way that you were trained, the way that I was trained in this stuff. It's a real paradigm shift in how we think about calorie expenditure.
All right, so yeah, this blows my mind. And first of all, I will say, for all of you listening, if you sort of listen to what Dr. Pontzer is saying, which I think this is incredibly cool, but I'm just going to repeat it and correct me if I get this wrong, Dr. Pontzer. But so you go to a community that all of us would agree, if we lived in this community, we'd be doing perhaps 2, maybe 3 times the activity that we're doing. We would be moving constantly, right? Yep. So I think the average, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the average American gets like 5,000 steps per day. So that's 2 to 3 times this if you're going and living in this Hadza community. And what you're expecting to find is, well, that means their total energy use for the day is going to be far exceed our own. Yeah, but instead, right, what you found was they're moving a ton more. But when we go and look at total daily energy expenditure, it actually is the same for the Western world, which then tells us we don't have, and I'm using your terminology here, I think we don't have an additive metabolism. It doesn't add exercise onto our resting energy expenditure. Instead, it constrains some aspect of metabolism to account for this extra activity that it's putting out. And so the next question is, what aspects of metabolism is it actually constraining? Because we have, the thermic effect of food. We have a non-exercise activity thermogenesis. We have the thermic effect of exercise. We have basal metabolic rate. Do we know which aspects of the metabolism is doing its accounting with? Do we know which of these elements are actually being suppressed as a result of excess energy expenditure?
Yeah, we have some good clues and we have some really good evidence, but right now it's sort of kind of tangential evidence. We haven't done the study. We're trying to get the money to do the study right now, where we get somebody exercising and we watch the dials turn on all their various other systems. But here's what we know. We've known this for years now. If you look at people who exercise regularly and people who don't, the people who exercise regularly have lower inflammation levels, right? Well, what's inflammation? Well, that's your immune system being active more than it needs to be active, right? Chronic inflammation is sort of background immune function that doesn't need to happen. People who don't exercise have higher stress reactivity. So, throughout your day, you have a stressful event. Maybe that could be like talking to a stranger is a stressful event psychologically. Your adrenaline levels go up, your cortisol levels go up, and then eventually come back down. That response is blunted and returns to normal faster if you're somebody who exercises all the time. So you're spent less energy on that. We know that people who exercise more seem to keep their reproductive hormones in a healthier place. So not sky high, but a little bit at a healthier level. And that seems to be related, we think, to the fact that people who exercise more have less reproductive cancers, lower risk of that. And so we can see the body turning down these kind of physiological systems. I don't expect that we're going to see the difference in the digestion costs of food, thermic effect of food. I don't think we're going to see it there. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. NEAT, this, do you fidget less? Do you sit instead of stand kind of stuff? Do you change your physical activity subtly? It could, that might contribute. I don't think it's going to explain all of it, but I think this is going to be across the board changes in our physiology. It's not going to be just one thing. Yeah. And that speaks to just how pervasive exercise is, right? It gets into every system, including our psychology, and has a huge beneficial effects across the board.
I love this. So we don't yet know. We just know that the metabolism is doing some accounting some way, and we have some good guesses. It could be inflammatory in reaction. It could be. So this is almost like it's becoming, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but more efficient in a sense, right? So it's dialing down certain aspects of function based on our ability to return to homeostasis faster because we've sort of trained ourselves with this hormetic sort of response of exercise. So it doesn't have this actually additive impact.
That's right.
Now, one of the things that kind of, I've been in the obesity world for a while clinically. And one of the things that I have done and played around with is this idea of putting people under eat less, exercise more, widening the calorie gap, intake and output for very short periods of time to decrease, in my mind, compensations being things like excess hunger, energy cravings, which we haven't touched on yet, where obviously exercise is known to cause increases in hunger and cravings and things like that, and seeing a better response with short sort of exposures to intake and output. I'm wondering, and that's one question I have for you is sort of in my work, is there anything to this? Because when I look at your graph and in that first paper I read, it seemed to be with exercise that it starts out just like we would expect. For a short period of time, it seems that it is additive. And then all of a sudden, we have this constrained effect. Do we have an idea of the time frame by which that happens? So there's sort of two interwoven questions there, I think. One is, what's the time frame? If you start an exercise program tomorrow and you're sedentary today, you start an exercise program tomorrow, how long until your body adjusts to that time, to that new workload? Because it won't be tomorrow, right? One way people get this idea wrong is they say, oh, you mean if I exercise tomorrow, it won't change my expenditure. It will, because you're still going to have day-to-day variation. We're talking about kind of a baseline day-to-day kind of long-term adjustment that your body makes to everything to account for this new lifestyle that you have. You're still going to have day-to-day adjustments. The background changes will happen more slowly and will have the effect of kind of canceling out the energy cost of the exercise or rejuggling the energy cost of the exercise, but it won't happen tomorrow. Yeah. So we think that timeline of adjustments happening, and this is based on weight loss studies where people try to get people to lose weight with just exercise alone. And you can watch the bodies adjust to that in terms of how many pounds they're losing.
That adjustment seems to kick in at about 3 months or so, give or take. This isn't well understood yet. So, but it's around that time frame. Okay. Now, the other question is, the other thing to think about is the other axis here is, if I'm completely sedentary and I exercise, are you telling me that I won't get any increase in expenditure at all from that very, very sedentary person to the person who's, running 30 miles a week or something like this? And the answer is, well, that's also not very well characterized yet. But as far as we can tell from exercise studies, again, exercise intervention studies, there does seem to be maybe a little bit of a rise. Maybe you can get 100 calories a day. Maybe if you're completely sedentary and you start exercising a lot, maybe you can get to about 100 calories a day more, maybe. And that's maybe where you'll stabilize. Not well understood. That 100 calories a day more doesn't seem to help you too much because you eat it up, right? So there's that compensation as well, is that not only does your body compensate with metabolism, but your hunger compensates to make you eat up those gains. And then in that case, we're also talking, remember, about somebody who's really completely sedentary and starts exercising. We're not talking about the people who are kind of already in the middle somewhere and decide to add more exercise to their life. We're not sure they'll see any gains at all, although that's an open question, exactly sort of how that plays out. So this is early days and all this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really exciting, and it's one of these things where I go, okay, this information is going to finally help us, perhaps, because it's a difficult area to deal with in the weight loss world. There's so much going on, and our results are abysmal when you look at the statistics. Yeah. But hopefully, this is going to help us sort of understand what's going on, so we can make real dents. But right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, based on what you're telling us. And we've heard this before in statements like you can't out-train a bad diet and stuff like that. But right now, it seems like if you're going to put any emphasis on either diet or exercise, you probably are going to really want to be focusing on diet and using exercise for its health benefits and perhaps to regulate inflammatory responses and hunger responses. I know there's a bell-shaped curve with this, right? So correct me if I'm wrong, but people who exercise more seem to be, they may get increased hunger as acutely related to exercise, but they seem to be able to control their hunger and cravings sort of better overall, is my understanding. Is that actually how it works for people? Yeah, I mean, I think so what you're talking about is changing our mindset from looking at exercise as having kind of this, it builds muscle and burns calories. And a lot of people, that's kind of what they think about when they think about exercise. That's how we've been trained. To move from that view to a view where exercise is this regulation changer, right? It's changing everything. It's kind of like the rhythm section for your body. And it's changing the way everything works together. And having that view of it, then it makes sense that it would do things like affect hunger and satiety feelings. And so I think you're right. There's good evidence that, if you are able to lose weight, for example, exercise helps you keep that weight off. Why is that? Well, we think it helps you match hunger and fullness feelings more appropriately to your new weight and your new normal. Yeah. And again, if people who are completely sedentary, who get zero exercise, truly at the far end of the spectrum there, they get so little activity that it seems that they get out of regulation in terms of hunger and fullness as well. And so there's kind of a dysregulation that happens there that really isn't about the calories. It's about the fact that you don't have the rhythm section. Your body's not listening to this kind of back and forth with activity. And so, I think all of those approaches, what you're talking about, makes total sense to me. And I think we'll get a lot farther. I mean, you asked, well, what if I do these short bursts? Am I going to be able to kind of get around the compensation issues, or is that going to work better than the long chronic changes in activity level? Maybe, I don't know. But what you're asking basically is a regulation question. Am I going to get different regulatory responses, different hormonal responses to exercise if I pattern it different ways? Perhaps. But that's what we need to do next, is stop thinking about exercise as just calories and muscle and start thinking about it as all these other things it does. Yeah, one of the things that, as I've read your work, I started to use a phrasing that I'll just check it with the expert here, but I started to say, what you really want is, you don't want a fast metabolism. You want a more flexible metabolism. It seems to me that the exercise is making you more flexible or a little bit more responsive. It's regulating sympathetic and parasympathetic balance. It's doing many different things. So I started speaking of it that way. I don't know that if you would say that is accurate or not, but it seems to me whenever I look at the research in general, and this goes into things like cold exposure and trying to speed up metabolism in any way, what we're also doing seems to be speeding up hunger and cravings or causing these compensations. And because you don't actually see cold exposure leading to weight loss, despite seeing short-term bumps in energy expenditure. And so there's this really weird thing that happens here where we go, oh, we want a fast metabolism. And I know you talk a lot about that in your book, where you're kind of like, well, you don't really want a fast metabolism, but I'm wondering if you like the idea of this more flexible aspect of metabolism, being able to choose your fuel sources, being able to regulate your hunger and be a more flexible sort of physiological state.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's I like the idea that you're basically putting sort of the species normal amount of activity back into your life, and all your systems are going to respond to that better and be more. And I think flexibility is a nice way to think about it. You're going to be able to respond to day-to-day changes in diet, day-to-day changes in activity in a healthier way because you have that activity, that chronic activity in your life. I'm down with that. I like that a lot. And in terms of this reminds me of some people have been asking, well, what about boosting my metabolism? And I talk a little bit about that in the book. But I think if somebody's telling you that you're going to boost your metabolism, that could be a new red flag for people. If you're if you're going to get your metabolism boosted, then you ask some questions about that, because probably that means that it's BS.
I understand. And it's funny because some of the marketing, it's like, we have to learn from this. Some of the marketing I have done in the past has using that language. And I think if we're going to be evidence-based and really pay attention to what the data is, we have to be able to change those kinds of, marketing and the kind of messaging that we have to be sort of more realistic. And that brings me to kind of some of the things where having someone like you on the show allows us to bust a lot of myths. And so I was wondering if we could do some of that, because one of the arguments we've had, and certainly I wrote a book back in 2010 that became a bestseller, partly because it talked about hormonal weight loss. And it one of the things in that is that, to me, I've always said there's two different ways to do this, or two things required. One, you need a calorie deficit. That's absolutely true. And I want to check with the expert to see, is that true? And two, you need sort of hormonal balance, which is a marketing term for, hey, we need to regulate our hunger and cravings. In other words, we need to sustain that calorie deficit over time. So from your perspective, do calories actually matter? Like this idea that calories don't matter, we shouldn't count them, we shouldn't pay attention to them. What does the expert in metabolism have to say on that for all of us? Yeah,
calories, when it comes to weight, it's just calories. Calories are all that matters, right? And it's really hard to keep track of them. So I can understand why people get frustrated with the idea of counting calories, and knowing how many calories you actually burn it turns out to be really hard to do unless you can measure it in a lab. So I get it that it's hard to keep track of them. But saying that calories don't matter for your weight is like saying money doesn't matter for your bank account, right? I mean, just because you're bad at accounting doesn't mean that it isn't still just cash in the bank. I mean, that's what that is. Yeah. And every gram of tissue on you is food that you ate that you didn't burn off, right? So you can think about all that food in terms of calories. It really is all calories when it comes to weight.
You covered a couple things, and I think some of this may be some other reading I've done, but just let me see if I get this correct, and maybe you can confirm or deny this. So when we're trying to even track, weigh, and measure calories, like looking at labels on food and off of menus and using MyFitnessPal, I've read data, and perhaps from you, that this is perhaps up to 15 to 20% inaccurate when we do that way to begin with. And then the other thing is that we can, depending on, sort of some of the data I've read, you can underestimate the amount that you have eaten by 25% up to 50%, depending on the individual. And I think it speaks to what you're sort of talking about here. The metabolism doesn't necessarily think in terms of days. So I always use the analogy, if you eat 200 less calories every day for 5 days, but then you overeat 700 calories on Saturday and Sunday, your psychological human brain goes, I ate less 5 days, I ate more 2 days, but your metabolism goes, you actually were in a 400 calorie excess, 1,000 and 1,400. And so I think some of this is going on, but is this true that we can't be 1,000% sure based on MyFitnessPal data, and that we are overestimating by that much? I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about, that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low carb protein in your pocket. These Paleo Valley beef sticks are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats, and they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now back to the show. It is time to talk about one of our sponsors, our earliest sponsor, Cured Nutrition. This is a CBD company. Cured Nutrition is another one of those next level human companies that is doing amazing things in the world. Let me tell you a little bit about one of the things I've been doing with CBD here recently. There is some really interesting research showing that chronic cannabis users, these are people who are smoking marijuana, are actually down-regulating the cannabinoid 1 receptor. Well, guess what the cannabinoid 1 receptor is involved in? Well, it's involved in cravings and hunger. And there is some really interesting mouse research that shows mice given products that lower CB1 or being engineered with a lower CB1 activity actually eat less and are not obese as a result of that. And so I have been experimenting using CBD to lower hunger, to down-regulate the CB1 receptor, just the way chronic cannabis users tend to be very thin. And it has been working very well. Now, of course, the other thing that I use this for and have used it for since day one is Cured Nutrition has a product called Zen that is a mix of magnesium and CBD and some other really nice formulations in there that I use to help me sleep. I have notoriously bad sleep. My sleep still is not perfect, but the Cured Nutrition product Zen has made a big difference to helping me sleep better. And that is just huge. Now, of course, they have other products. They also have a product called Rise, which I do not use, but I have used in the past. It is great for those people who like to have a pick-me-up in the morning to focus better. So Zen and Rise are fantastic, but any of their CBD products used for down-regulation of the CB1 receptor to help with hunger and cravings, if you're one of these people who is constantly overeating and on a diet, you find that, hey, when I'm on a diet, I get this crazy sort of hunger and cravings. This may be something you want to check out. So check out curednutrition.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. I get a kickback to help us have these discussions on the show. It's a great way for me to be able to do this work. So thank you for Cured Nutrition for that. Of course, Cured Nutrition gets the sale, and you get to work with a fantastic company that gets results with their supplements. I hope you will check them out. curednutrition.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now let's go ahead and get back to the show. Let's do it.
it's kind of interesting. It's one of those psychological, it's like a society-wide psychological experiment. We're told our whole adult lives that humans burn 2,000 calories a day. And then you put somebody in a study and ask them how many calories they think they're eating and burning every day. And they keep very careful track. And wouldn't you know it, it's about 2,000 calories a day, right? And it actually, if you measure how many calories they're eating and burning, they're off by 30% or more, like you said, on average. I mean, some people get it dead on, sure. But on average, we get about 30%. We undercount by about 30% of the calories we think we're eating. So that you're missing a meal a day, a meal's worth of calories a day, something like that, right?
That's crazy. Yeah.
And we all do it. And, there's no, across cultures, people do it. It is crazy. And so you add the fact that you have a very hard time keeping track of the calories you eat, to add that to the fact that you have a very hard time knowing how many calories you burn. Because, you go to MyFitnessPal, you said you did the run, you said you're this big, and it tries to do the additive thing. And it doesn't account for the fact that your metabolism is juggling, right?
Always changing.
For good luck, man. Good luck trying to keep track of your calories. And then somebody comes in, swoops in and says, well, I got your answer for you. It's because calories don't matter. And you go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Because I can't, Yep. So I think that's the gap in understanding where people can swoop in and becomes a real ripe area for some misinformation in science, I think.
Makes great sense. Here's another one we oftentimes hear, like, I'm a big muscle bound guy. I work out with weights. A lot of people say, oh, I'm burning hundreds of calories for every pound of muscle I have on my body. How much are we actually burning when we put on, extra muscle? Is it really this big of a deal?
I can tell you the answer for that. We know it's about 40 kilocalories per kilogram.
So
in terms of a day,
it's not much.
No. So if you gain 10 pounds of muscle, then that works out to what, about 200 calories a day? It's not nothing. Yeah. It's not nothing. But if you put down 10 pounds of muscle, you might feel like you're doing even more than that. But so it's not nothing, but it's not hundreds per pound or something like that. No.
Just to change gears here, because it's one, I was like, I gotta ask Dr. Pontzer this. Do you think perhaps that we become, and has this been looked at, do we become more efficient as we exercise? When we think, is this perhaps that actually the energy we burn with exercise as we do it over and over again? Like, let's say you and I go out for a run together, and let's say we burn 200 calories, and then we keep doing that month after month. Do you think you're going to find, or do we have data that says, well, actually, after 3 months, you're actually not burning 200 calories from that exercise anymore. You're burning more like 150. I'm just curious. Does it work that way?
It's the short answer is no. The longer answer is it depends. So if it's something like running, where you have done it since you were a kid and we're all equally pretty good at it, then you don't see a benefit there, because the benefits you get are mechanical, right? So, and actually, this would be something really fun to do, and I don't think it's been done very well when you are in resistance training, right? So think about all the different exercises you do to build and maintain muscle in the gym, lifting weights. The technique really matters, particularly for not hurting yourself, but also for being able to maximize how much weight you're lifting. Probably the technique matters as well for how many calories you're burning, even if that's not what you're focused on in the gym. It probably does affect it. So things where technique is important and it's a new thing that you don't do in your daily life, then you'll see an efficiency gain from that for sure. I don't think it's going to be 30 or 40%, but it might be 10 or 20%. When people have studied either elite runners versus weekend warrior kind of guys, or have taken moderate exercisers and trained them to run more and more and more and more and measured efficiency changes that way, those differences are really small, right? Because if you're running, again, it's a task everybody kind of does. And so you might see 1 or 2% marginal differences in efficiency, and sometimes you see nothing depending on the study. It's really not a big player.
So this is going to be interesting, really sort of understanding over time with your work and other people's work, what is the actual component that's changing the most in this constrained model? Yeah. It's really interesting. Now, one of the things I love about your work is that there are so many people, and I know for someone like you, this must drive you crazy, man. But it's like, there's so many people over the years talking about paleo man this, paleo man that. And here's a guy who actually lived with, quote, paleo man and has studied multiple types of hunter-gatherer tribes. And so I want to talk about this myth, because if we were to listen to the common sort of dogma out there from podcasters and
Right.
bloggers and YouTubers, what we would think is that paleo man was eating nothing but lard and protein and no carbohydrates whatsoever, and they were all ketogenic. Educate us on this. What's the deal here? Because you're someone who's studied multiple hunter-gatherers, not just living hunter-gatherers, but you've studied actual, anthropological data, looking at, people who have long since deceased, looking at, their bones and looking and digging through the soil and seeing looking at the ash and looking at all the things that they may have been consuming. And so I'm curious from you, school us on this. Like, what is the actual deal with this? Is that true or not? Are we supposed to just be eating, fat and protein?
No, is a short answer. So the, a group like the Hadza, for example, so a hunter-gatherer group living in a warm climate, first of all, there's a lot of diversity. And so there's a weird thing that happens when people cast their minds back to the Stone Age or whatever. All of a sudden, they think that there was only one diet around the whole globe. How ridiculous would that be? I mean, is there one diet around the globe right now? I don't think so. I know that when I go to get takeout, I might get Chinese or Mexican or Thai or whatever, or Italian. I mean, there's different cuisines today. You don't think there always was? And so first of all, there was an incredible amount of diversity. And we know that because we've got data of most of these groups are, living in towns and cities now, but we have data from the 1800s and early 1900s when we still can capture groups, data from groups living hunter-gatherer lifestyles, hundreds of them. And there's an incredible amount of diversity. And if you're a warm climate group like the Hadza, who I work with, it's a mix of plants and animals, about 50-50 on average. But that changes hugely day to day, changes week to week. And a piece of the puzzle that nobody talks about in the paleo world, or they don't like to talk about it, is honey, right? As a group like I work with, like the Hadza, about 10 to 20% of their diet is honey. And honey is just sugar and water.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. It is crazy. So if you look at, we've done the analysis. If you look at how many carbs a Hadza man or woman eat, it's more than you get as a percentage of calories. It's more than we're eating in the States, right? And the idea that you would sort of have zero carbs in your diet or so low carbs you're in ketosis all the time, we have absolutely zero evidence of that for any warm or even temperate climate hunter-gatherers. That just doesn't happen. Now, it is true that in the Arctic, you notice if you ever pay attention to this, the paleo folks like to point to two groups of folks, two kinds of communities to support their ideas that the past was all meat. One is Arctic populations like Inuit, Eskimo groups. And another group is pastoralists like the Maasai, who live they herd cattle for their living. Both of those lifestyles are about 8,000 years old, 9,000 years old, about the same as farming, right? Which, of course, farming is supposed to be new and crazy and weird and not representative. But these groups somehow are representative. Anyway, humans eat a diverse amount of diverse foods. They eat what's there, right? So yeah, if you live in the Arctic, you don't eat many plants. Of course not. But if you live in warm weather, it's a mix, man. So yeah, that's. And I'll say this: if you have a keto diet and it works for you, that's great. Good for you. But what kills me as somebody who studies human evolution is the kind of rewriting of our past to sort of justify your very particular diet.
Yeah.
And the vegan, there are vegan evangelists who do it too, right? In the past, we were eating all plants, and I don't understand it. I think there's a human drive to justify, yourself, and not to say I do this because it works for me, but to say I do this because it's the only way and it's what's right for all humans. Yeah. And that drive, I think, pushes us to do some funny gymnastics with the past.
I agree. It's almost like, you had religion and politics, and now throw nutrition into that. And that's the state that sort of we're in. But I do think there are people, because of all the craziness, who are wanting to understand how to be an agnostic scientific mind. Yeah. And so it's nice to have someone like you who this is what you do. You have an agnostic scientific mind. You're not attached to anything. You're just attached to the data. I think for all of us, we want to try to be that way and get beyond our biases, which is nice to talk to someone like you to kind of say, hey, look, let's look at the data. The data don't support this. One of the things you said is I think your terminology used is that we are opportunistic omnivores. In other words, we wouldn't be around, you and I would not be having this conversation if we humans could not exploit multiple different types of foods. And we did. One of the things that I'll just to finish this conversation, because we have people say, oh, well, we're all supposed to be eating raw. We're all supposed to be eating these kinds of things. So one of the things that, I think is important too, is this kind of stuff true? Like as humans, my understanding is that, fire was a huge boon for us evolutionarily that helped us get more calories out of our food. And if we did not have cooking, then perhaps we still would not be talking today, that this was a big deal for us as humans as we evolved.
Absolutely. No, fire is basically a way to externally digest your food, right? Mm-hmm. And our digestive systems have adapted to that. And now if we try to eat a raw food diet and raw food only, people have studied this. Men and women who only eat raw food diets have a hard time keeping healthy weight. Women often stop cycling, right? And stop menstruating, stop ovulating. That's not a great evolutionary solution, right? I mean, evolution is about having kids. So men and women report reduced libido. There's all sorts of good evidence that raw foodism, strict raw foodism isn't really a human thing. In fact, we depend on cooked food. And the other thing I'd say is people have a hard time on raw food diets today, and that's with domesticated foods, right? That's with super low fiber, high sugar vegetables and plants, fruits and vegetables. That's with fatty domesticated animals to eat, right? If you are eating lean wild game and undomesticated plants, good luck on a raw food diet. We're just not built for it anymore. We've had fire for so long, our bodies are actually evolutionarily adapted to eating cooked food, and we have a hard time without it.
So interesting. What's your thought? So what's your thought on, I was in a debate the other day with someone who's a carnivore advocate. I know you've heard of the carnivore diet.
Sure.
They were essentially saying we do not require any fiber, and our paleo ancestors did not eat a lot of fiber. Now, my understanding, and again, I want you to correct me, but my understanding is that they're getting like up to 100 to 150 grams of fiber daily. We're getting more like 30 grams. Is this true? Am I in the ballpark here, or am I off?
No, you're right. Groups like the Hadza get, maybe not 100, but 80, 90 grams of fiber easily a day. And undomesticated plant foods, which again are half the diet in most warm weather places, half the time. They're full of fiber. When you domesticate plants, what people did is they picked they kept on getting, breeding the ones that had more starch, more sugar, and less fiber. And so you go to the grocery store today and they're actually low fiber compared to the past. The idea that we had a low fiber diets or zero fiber diets is just, it's part of that kind of mythology of the carnivore past. And there isn't any evidence for it. I think it's really, again, kind of rewriting the past to justify your modern diet.
Yeah, it must be baffling for you when you see the data all the time to be like, where are they kind of getting this from? But I think it was really interesting to kind of understand they're getting it from, the Maasai and Inuits primarily, who are relatively as recent as sort of agriculture. So I think it's sort of really interesting what we do with nutrition. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about briefly, and then, I know you want to be respectful of your time, but one of the things that I have read and have done most of my life, personal trainer, 25 years before I went to I have my degree in naturopathic medicine. I've done obesity medicine primarily clinically and written books on that. One of the things that I think people are going to want me to ask you, because they're like, well, Jade, you've written an awful lot about the idea of high intensity interval type of training and this epoch response. And this essentially, quote, boosts the metabolism. And I think you've answered this. And I think it's basically like, well, you might get a little bit of an uptick, post workout, or you might get, maybe that particular day, but the body compensates for that weeks and sort of months down the line. But what do you say about people when they say, well, what about the afterburn effect of exercise and, this short, intense exercise or resistance training versus cardio? Aren't these things different?
Yeah. We don't have any evidence that they're different right now. I would say I would love to see a study where we randomize people into different groups. You do HIIT, you do cardio, you do resistance. And we see not just the fitness effects of that would be interesting, but I want to see the metabolic effects. And it's a really clear prediction. If doing HIIT exercise raises metabolism and doesn't have this compensation effect, we can measure that. That's very doable.
We should see an additive effect instead of a constrained effect.
Yeah, I mean, could be. Like you say, I'm an agnostic, data-driven guy. I try to be. I mean, we're all human, but I try to be. And if that's what that's where the data take us, then that would be super cool. But we don't have any evidence for that right now. As far as we can tell right now, it really is kind of like just the total workload, however you get it. That's the cue that your body is listening to in terms of metabolism. Now, of course, you're going to get different muscle responses in terms of muscle building versus toning, of course. But in terms of like the metabolic response of calories per day, it seems to be sort of gross workload as far as we can tell.
Yeah. And my guess would be it wouldn't make a difference if I'm thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective and adaptation. When I started reading your book, I was kind of like, this makes sense. Would we really want a metabolism, and would it be a survival advantage to have a metabolism that was additive in that way? Wouldn't we want a metabolism to say, this calorie gap's getting pretty big, I better start, budgeting things a little bit in case I run out of gas on the planes, right? So I don't know if you share that, but my guess would be it's probably not necessarily going to matter that much. But I can't wait to see. One of the things that I have read, and I'm curious if you've looked at this, but I forget. I think Christopher Scott is his name. He wrote a series of articles back, I think, in 2015. But basically, he was talking about the idea, and this may go a little bit beyond what most of the listeners will be able to kind of comprehend. So I'll try to not botch this, and maybe you can correct me. But, one of the things that you're doing in your studies is doubly labeled water, right? And so if I understand this correctly, and for everyone listening, and Dr. Pontzer, I'm speaking to the expert, so I'm a little, you can correct me on this. But if we were going to try to measure all of us, if we were all out with the Hadza, and the old way of measuring energy expenditure would be like to basically hook us up with an oxygen mask and measure CO2 and the amount of oxygen we're taking in, the amount of CO2 we're breathing off. One of the things that you started doing was saying, well, that's not practical to do in this setting.
Right.
But we're going to do this doubly labeled water, which corresponds exactly with sort of the CO2 O2 ratio, something in research they call the respiratory quotient or whatever that a lot of people won't know. But this is still sort of based on the idea of aerobic energy expenditure. And so one of the things Christopher Scott talks about is this idea as we basically go into anaerobic metabolism and we create lactic acid from lactate, that there's a heat sort of thing that happens there when you break that bond of lactate back to go to glycolysis. So he's saying we're missing that heat component in our sort of understanding of using doubly labeled water to predict this heat response. This is sort of science that sort of is beyond me. But if that is the case, then how do we eventually account for that? Is it possible then that high intensity energy, anaerobic output, we're missing a significant amount of our energy predictions because we're not able to directly measure heat and we're extrapolating through these aerobic gases?
Yeah. Until you look at that pathway specifically, but this is how a scientist answers that question. Until you look at that pathway specifically in isolation and measure it, then it's all in the world of hypothesis, right? But here's what I can tell you about the data. Doubly labeled water has been validated, against humans in metabolic chambers, in which can be validated against heat production, a lot. It's the best validated technique we have for free living subjects. And it works not just for humans, it works for other species too. And so we can't be missing much because it wouldn't validate if we were missing a lot.
Yeah.
And you had it exactly right that if you are breaking down your glucose molecule and you are doing it so quickly with anaerobic metabolism that you kick out a lactate molecule, as opposed to going into your mitochondria, it's going to come back, right? It's going to come back and get metabolized aerobically. So everything is aerobic metabolism eventually, even if it's not while you're doing the lift. And is there a little bit of sort of heat that's lost in the chemical transition back? It can't be that big. It just No, I don't believe so.
Yeah. And that's really cool the way you put that, right? Because I think for those of you who are following us, essentially what you're saying is we've had people in, in metabolic chambers where we're measuring heat changes and gas exchanges, and there's not much difference in that. So I love that. So I want to leave it to you to kind of tell us where we go next with this. Your work is absolutely fantastic. I think it's incredibly important to have a PhD who's an actual real expert in this stuff, educating all of us. What else would you want all of us to know, or do you find sort of interesting and sort of on the horizon that we should all be looking forward to?
Yeah. Well, a few things. One is I think that question of exactly what changes and in what timeline as we change our lifestyles, right? How does our body adapt? What exactly does change and what changes first and what changes most? That's a set of questions that's going to keep folks like me busy for the next 5 or 10 years. So, so watch this space. If you want to know where this goes, that's where that science is going to go. And we're really excited about that. For me personally, and somebody who gets to work with groups like the Hadza and other groups around the world is so exciting and fun. I've been struck in the last few years about how it's not just diet and exercise that keeps them so healthy, right? They're outside all the time. They have social connection throughout their whole life. They don't live, there's not a lot of economic inequality in a place like Hadza land. And so I do wonder, and I'd love to know more, these connections between being outdoors, psychological health, and cardiometabolic health, and what those connect. We know in the U.S. that if you are depressed or if you have social isolation, that leads to bad health, and that's treated separately from the diet and exercise issue. But I would love to see those get put together in useful, interesting ways, and kind of integrate that. Those are the two big things for me. How do we go further, deeper with this exercise response thing? And then how do we also broaden to bring in other elements of lifestyle and ask how they affect health and happiness?
Yeah, and I have a few things I want to just throw out as a last thing to kind of get your thoughts on. So part of how I have always seen metabolism is I've always seen it more as a stress barometer, right? It's sort of like this sensing and responding apparatus. And so from that perspective, I've always thought the wider the gap gets between intake and output of calories, that becomes a stress to that, or a pressure building up on that stress barometer. And then of course, the metabolism's whole job is to kind of get us back to homeostasis and take internal signals from the cells and external signals from the environment and plot a response. And so if that response is then getting us back to homeostasis, is there a way to essentially begin to say, and I think this is what you were just speaking to, the idea of what is then psychological stress doing to when does exercise become a stress to this stress barometer? What is the point that under eating becomes a stress to this barometer? How much of it is this measuring of this gap between intake and output? And the wider that gap gets, the more of a negative response we get. And the more narrow we keep that gap, perhaps that we are not getting as much of a response. But I'm interested in all of this, and it's people like your work that is helping me sort of understand this. But I wonder if you have sort of any thoughts on that sort of model as just metabolism as stress barometer. And if we're going to be looking at it then we can go into, all right, then what is our social connection telling us? What is our over exercising or under exercising? Both can be a stress. What is overeating and under eating? Both can be a stress. Sleep deprivation, in a sense, all of these things are playing into this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really nice way to think about it. And what that gets at, which I think is crucial, is understanding that your metabolism is responding to you. You're not pushing it, or you don't push it around. It's behind the scenes adapting to you in ways that are hard to pay attention to and hard to keep track of. And so, it's what is your metabolism? It's all your body's cells at work, right? And it's all your body juggling its energy allocation to different tasks and responding. And so when we think about it that way, that kind of holistic evolutionary kind of perspective, I think that gets us a lot further towards then asking those questions. Okay, well, now what if I add psychological stress to this? What if I add, because now you're not asking this sort of just in this sort of layered, grocery bill way. What if I add this and this and this and this? What's my bill at the end of the day? Now you're asking, in this responsive, flexible, dynamic system, if I poke it here, how does that move? And if I poke it here, how does that move? Right. And you're asking about response and compensation. That's the way we should be thinking about this. I think that's the interesting next maybe a better paradigm for thinking about how exercise and other lifestyle factors all fit together.
I just have to say to thank you so much for your work, and also thank you for taking the time. It is so rare that we get an expert like you to show up and actually sort of set us straight. Make sure you check out Dr. Pontzer's book, Burn. It's if you were interested in this discussion, it goes through all of this in a more simple and elegant way, I think, because, having me in the discussion, I think I can kind of botch things up a little bit, but the book is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your work. Where can people, if they want to keep up with your work besides living on PubMed and stuff like that, are you active on any social media, Twitter, Instagram, anything like that? Where can people keep up with you?
Yeah, I'm most active on Twitter. So check me out there at Herman Pontzer. I have a little bit of Instagram time, but I not enough, I guess. And
I've been tagging you a lot. I've been tagging you a lot lately, man, just so you know.
I got to get back on there. It's sort of trying to find enough time in the day because it's so fun. You could spend your day on that stuff. So I try to be good, but I'm mostly on Twitter actually. But yeah, please check us out. The lab website, we try to keep up to date if you want to check us out here at Duke. And then one thing I'd also say is, if you want to keep track of what's going on with the Hadza, and particularly if you want to maybe even help them out because they could use your support, we run a group called Hadza Fund, HADZAFUND.org. And it's our way of supporting that community that's given us so much and that we work with so closely and have these deep friendships with. And it's our way of giving back. So it also talks about the work we do there and a little bit about their culture. So it's a nice thing to check out if you're interested.
HADZAFund.org.
Yes.
I will definitely be checking that out. Dr. Pontzer, thank you for your work. I'll be keeping up with you, and hopefully we can have you again sometime in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great conversation.